Hello and welcome to part 40 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, we're going to be setting up a custom eye rig in order to animate the eyes and where the eyes are looking on our Minecraft character. Now if you want to go ahead and download the exact file that I'm starting with, you can find a link to download that in the description area below. Just to recap, in the last video, we set up the custom bone shapes for all of the bones that we want to be able to see for a Minecraft character in order to animate it and pose it. Since the last video though, I went ahead and I added a few more custom bone shapes. In the last video, I did not give custom bone shapes to the 2 arm bones for each arm and the 2 leg bones for each leg. And I decided that it would be a good thing to be able to see those in terms of their bone shapes. Even though you're not going to be controlling the 2 arm bones directly, you're just going to be animating with the IK target, which we did give a shape. I decided it would be a good thing to be able to see those bone shapes as well. So you can see where the arms are. In case you're only looking at the bones, you can still see the arms and the legs. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to flip over to only the mesh of my object. So let's go ahead and select that and go into edit mode. And we need to start by modeling the eyes of the character. Right now we only have a texture, so obviously this texture, I'm not that happy with it, to be honest. We're going to have to redo it because I'm going to be adding more edge loops, and we're going to be extruding inwards and modeling some square eyes. So we're going to have to redo the UV map again, but that'll be outside of this video. Let's go ahead and make a loop cut around where the eyes are going to be. I might move them down slightly so we have more room for eyebrows and things like that. So I'll press Ctrl R in edit mode. That'll bring me up a loop cut. I'll click and I'll put the middle of the eye right about there. I'm going to go ahead and bevel that. So I'll press Ctrl B and move my mouse outwards, and that's going to be about the height of the eye. I might slide them down. And yeah, of course it's messing up my UV map because when you move around edges it does that. But again, we're going to redo the UV map, the texture, so I'm not going to worry about that. Let's go ahead and do a loop cut around the middle of the face. So Control R, click, right click, and then I'm going to bevel that. So I'll Control B, and I'm going to go to the outside of the eye, which is right about there. I'm kind of using these eyes as a guide, but I'm not following them. They're going to be a little bit lower down and a little bit more square instead of rectangular. Alright, let's go ahead and do another Control R in the middle, and then right click, and then Control B to put that, or to split it apart into 2. So if I'm looking where the eyes are, there's going to be an eye right there and an eye right there. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to do one more edge loop in the middle. That's just going to help us out later. So click, right click, and now we can start thinking about the eyes and in terms of what we're going to do with them besides just having a face for each one. I'm actually going to go ahead and do a loop cut around the middle horizontally. Click, right click, and then Control R, do one up and down for the middle of the eyes as well. So click and right click, and Control R, click and right click. So we've got the faces we need for the eyes, but I do want to inset them or extrude them inwards. So I'm going to grab all 4 in face select mode. So let's go ahead and extrude inwards. So with those 8 faces selected, I'll tap E and just go a little bit inwards. Now the reason why I have these edges going in between is because we want to make a little bit of a roundness to the eyes, or at least I do. So I'm going to do some insetting here, but I have to do each eye separately at this point. So I'm going to select one eye, and then I'll maybe go to my front view, and I'll press 5 to go into orthographic front view. And now I'll press I and go inwards a little bit. I could use numbers to measure how far I'm going inwards, but I'm not going to be that picky. Into vertices select mode, I'm going to select the 4 corners and just make them go inward. So I'll press S to scale them, and that way there'll be some roundness to it. I'm going to get these 4 faces again, and I'll move them out a little bit. And I'm going to repeat that process one more time. This time I'm going to press the I key, so I to inset, and I'll pull them in. And I've got select outer unchecked, which I prefer, so that it selects the inner ones and not the ring, which is the default way that the I key, the inset tool, does it. So I'll move this one out, and that looks pretty good to me. I might take those 4 faces and scale them up just a little bit to make it a little bit more evenly, or not flat as it reaches the edge of the eye. So let's go ahead and do the same thing again for the other side. So I'll select those 4, go to my front orthographic view, I'm going to pull it to right about there. I'm trying to match the top of that with the top of this. So S, and then I'll grab the 4 corner vertices, and I'm going to scale them inwards, and we'll grab these 4 faces, and I'm going to pull them out just a little bit. What I might do is go into my side view and go into wireframe so I can match. And of course, switching into wireframe is with the Z key on your keyboard. Okay, so right about there, and then and I'm going to try to match it as closely as I can. Scale. And I don't know if that's exactly right, but it looks pretty close to me. I'm not that worried about being totally precise because, again, it's Minecraft. It's supposed to look blocky. Okay, so we've got the eyes modeled. I'll go back into my material shading so I can see the textures again, even though they don't really matter anymore because they're off. And we're going to add the pupils, which are going to be separate objects, which are going to be the things that are controlled by bones that we have to create still. So what I'll do is, actually with these 4 faces still selected, I'm going to press Shift S. And again, Shift S is this really handy snap menu. And what I want to do is put my cursor to the objects or faces that I have selected. So Shift S, cursor to selected, and now my 3D cursor is right there. So if I press Shift A, still in edit mode, I'm going to do a Shift A to add a new object or a mesh because we're already in a mesh. And I'm going to add a new cube, which is going to be the pupil. But obviously it's way too big. So I'll tap S and scale way down until I get the pupil size that I want. It's really deep right now. I'm actually going to move it out, and then we'll use our scale gizmo and scale it to be a bit thinner. We do want it to be a little bit thicker than you might think. It's not just a 2D object. It should actually have some depth to it. And what I might do here is actually do a few loop cuts. So I'll do a Control R, click, right click around each direction, including that one, so we have some control. Click, right click. And now what I might do is grab my edge loop. So I'll hold Alt and right click. That's again Alt and right click. So now I can scale SZ and make it just a little bit more round. So again, I'll hold Alt, right click in the opposite direction, and S and then X on my keyboard, and that'll make it just a little bit round, not totally square. If you want to keep your square, that's totally okay. I might grab these front faces and I might bring them out a little bit further, maybe just a little bit, and scale them just to give the eye pupil a little bit of roundness. And I think I'm going to grab these back 4 and drag them back just to give it some more depth, because this is not flat. The surface of the eye isn't flat, so we want to be able to make sure that it doesn't, stick out more than it needs to, or have a gap between the eye and the pupil. So we have a pupil. What I'll do is I'll put my mouse over this pupil and I'll press L to select it. Actually, I'll make sure nothing is selected with the A key first. L to grab that one, and I'm going to duplicate it, Shift D, and I'm going to press X on my keyboard and slide it over and put it right in the middle again. So I'm just eyeballing this, pun intended. There we go. That was a bad joke. I apologize. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of new geometry here. We have a bunch of new edge loop cuts to make the outline of the eyes. We've got a bunch of insets. We have a lot of new geometry here, and we haven't told our bones about that. So I'm going to press Tab to go back into edit mode, or to object mode rather, and I'm going to go to my Wrench tab, because when you add an armature to control a mesh, it automatically adds an armature modifier. When you have bones and you have a mesh and you select the mesh and then select the bones, which we did in previous videos, and then we press Control P and we select parent with automatic weights, it automatically adds that armature modifier to the mesh, and that's what actually makes the mesh be controlled by the armature or the skeleton. I actually want to delete that, so I'm going to select the mesh and click the X. Before we parent the mesh to the armature again, I need to add a few more bones for the eye. So I'll go to my front view, and I'm actually going to go and put my 3D cursor back to where that eyeball is. So I'll press Tab to go back into the edit mode of my mesh, and I'm going to select one of the eyeballs again. I already have that one selected, but I'll select this one. I'll press A and A to make sure nothing else is selected, and L with my mouse over that one to select that island. Now, let's go ahead and press Shift S to bring up the snap menu. That's Shift S and cursor to selected to bring our 3D cursor right there. And now I'm going to flip back into object mode by pressing Tab, of course. I'm going to select a bone and press Tab to go into edit mode of my armature. Now when you go into edit mode of an armature, even if you have bone shapes, which we do obviously, you get to see the original bones again, because when you're in edit mode you get to edit the structure, and so you no longer see the bone shapes, but that's totally okay. With our 3D cursor right there, and inside edit mode of the armature, I'll press Shift A, and that will add a new bone starting where that pupil is, so you can see that's where it is. I want the bone though to start inside the head, but I'm going to move it straight back on the y-axis. I still have the local mode selected, but it is actually the global y-axis. So I'm going to drag that straight back, and I want to move this one exactly where the 3D cursor is, exactly in the middle of that pupil. So with this nub selected, I'll press Shift S, and this time I'll say selection to cursor. So the selected thing will go to the cursor. Shift S, selection to cursor, and now we have the eye bone where it should be. I'm going to go ahead and name that bone. So with the bone selected in edit mode, I'll go to the bone tab, and I'm going to call this eye dot, and this is his right side. I always sort of have to position myself to figure out which side that is. That's his right side, but our left looking at him from the front. Let's go ahead and go back to our front orthographic view, because I'm just going to duplicate this bone and move it over. Before I do that though, I'm actually going to make a target bone. Now with this eye setup, we're not going to be doing an IK setup. I actually did a video on that, and I'll put a thumbnail and a link to that on the screen right now. If you're interested in doing more of an organic, like a round eyeball that actually rotates to point in the direction of eye targets, I made a video on that a while back. This is going to be similar, although we're not going to be using an IK constraint to make this bone actually rotate. We're going to be making this bone move with the target bone, and we're going to set constraints so you can't move the pupil outside of the eyeball. So different ways of making an eye rig. This is more appropriate for a square-headed person for Minecraft. So I'm going to go to my side view, and we'll duplicate this bone, Shift D, and I'm going to press Y to only move on the Y-axis, and out here in the distance is going to be the target for this bone. So I'm going to name this bone I target dot R, which already has an R on it, so I'll just get rid of the .001, and that looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to duplicate both of these for the other side. So I'll go back to my front view with both bones selected, Shift D, and then I'll press X to move only side to side. And again, here's a pun, I'm going to eyeball it. I'm just going to move it to where I think it should be, not using any snap menus, just approximating where it should go. And we got to rename these, so I'll select that bone, I.L, and this is going to be iTarget.L. Now, here's the thing when you're animating eyes. Generally, the eyes move together, but not always. There are certain circumstances where maybe you're doing a very cartoony effect, and you want the eyes to move in different directions, in their own direction, or maybe you want him to go cross-eyed. So we're going to allow you to do that. Each eyeball will be controlled separately, but we want to create another bone in the middle, which is going to be a parent of these two bones, so you can just move the controller for both eyes if you want to move them both at once, or you can animate each bone separately. So I'm going to select both of the target bones for the eyes, and I'm going to press Shift S because we want to put our 3D cursor right there. Shift S, and we're going to say cursor to selected. So because these two are selected, the 3D cursor goes right in the middle, and I'm going to press Shift A. We're still in edit mode of the armature, by the way. Shift A, and it adds a new bone starting right there. I can just drag it straight down, and there we go. I'm going to name this bone I target. Sure, I'll use my camel case naming. So I, then capital T for target, and I'll press Enter. So we've got all the bones set up, and they're all named, but we have to start making sure they constrain to one another. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to select the two eye target bones and parent them to the middle main eye target bone. So I'll select these two, select the middle one last, Control P, make parent, and I'll select keep offset. So again, that's Control P, of course, and keep offset. We don't want them to snap to where this one is. We want them to stay separate. So we've got that. So if I go back and press Tab to go back into pose mode, I move this one, both left and right eye targets move. But now we want this bone to be constrained to move along with this one. and we want this bone to be constrained to move along with this one. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a copy location constraint. So in pose mode, I'm going to select the eyeball, which is going to be the one that we're going to be controlling or adding a constraint to, and I'm going to go over to the bone constraints tab, and the constraint we're going to add is copy location. Now when we add it, it might snap. No, it's not going to snap yet until we actually specify the target. So we want to specify the target to be this bone. So right here in the constraint of the bone that we have selected, let's go ahead and type in armature. Right there, then we're specify a bone. So it's going to be iTarget.r. So iTarget.r. Now, that's what I was going to get to. It's going to snap up to this one because it wants to copy the exact location, but we don't want that. We don't want it to copy the location on the y-axis. We want to have it copy just on the z and x axes. So I'm going to uncheck the y right there in the options. So now, if I move this bone, it's going to move along with it. But again, we got to stop it from going outside the eyeball, so not too high up, not too low down, and not too much to either side. Let's go and do the same thing though on the other eyeball. So I'm going to add a bone constraint under the bone constraints tab in the properties window. Add bone constraint, copy location. I got to specify a target, so it's going to be iTarget.L, and then we uncheck Y. And if that's not the y-axis for you, you might have to play around with these world spaces versus local spaces. Sometimes if you change world space, which means the actual global axes versus the axes in terms of how the bone is rotated, sometimes you might have to use local space to local space, and that might work for you as well. Although it looks like this bone has the same axes as the world space, so I'll flip those back. It doesn't matter in this case, it might matter for you. Normally I keep both of these on world or local, and I don't mix and match them, although you might want to play around with that. I just realized that we forgot to attach these eye bones to the actual head bone. That's important, so I'll go back into edit mode, I'll press tab, and I'm going to select these two eyeball bones, and I'll select the head bone last, and I'll press Control P, because we want to be able to have the eyes move with the head, assuming that I rotate or pose the head. So Control P, and then keep offset. So now we'll see the dotted lines, which means that if I animate the head, the eyeballs will move along with it. So let's go ahead and constrain this main eye target bone so that it can't move too far to make the pupils move out of the eyeballs. So with that bone selected, I'm going to add a bone constraint, of course, under the bone constraints tab in the properties window. So we're going to go ahead and add a limit location constraint. So let's go ahead and click that. And now when we add that, of course, we get it green, because when you add a bone constraint generally to a bone, it becomes green or yellow. What we want to do here is constrain the movement or the location of this bone so that when we move it, it stops right about there. And then on the other direction, on the x-axis, it stops right about there. And then on the y-axis, it won't go above there or below there. So I'll press Alt-G to get rid of that, because what I want to do is actually look at where this is and copy the coordinates so that I know that, when it's at this coordinate, that's as far as we want to go positively on the x-axis. In the direction that we're looking at right now, both on our gizmo and on the little icon down here, the positive direction on the x-axis is in the way that the gizmo is pointing. Now I might want to check that with global orientation of the gizmo, but yeah, in the direction that it goes in all three axes is a positive direction. The opposite, in other words, going in this direction, the way my mouse cursor is moving, that is the negative direction on that x-axis. So I'm going to press Alt-G, I'll press N to bring up my properties panel, and I'm going to move the controller bone over until I think about as far as I want to go on the x-axis. Now if I look, Alt-G, the pupil is larger than this bone. So basically when I get to right about here, there's the edge of the eye right there. There's going to be a little bit of a gap there. That's okay. That's as far as I want the bone to go. So how far did I move it? Well, I moved it 0.18694, and I want to copy that over to the maximum X location over here. So what I'll do is I'll just put my mouse cursor over this value, and I'll press Control C. You don't have to select it. You can just put your mouse cursor over it, Control C, and then I'll go down here and I'll check maximum X, and I'll paste Control V. And as you can see, it's in there. So just copying and pasting by hovering over does work. Okay, so now if I press Alt G over here, I can only move it that far. It stops me. Believe me, it's stopping me. So let's go ahead and do the other direction on the -Y. So to right about there. So let's go ahead and look at that value, negative 0.19. That's okay. Control C, and then minimum X, Control V. So Alt G, and now it will stop me side to side. Let's go ahead and clear that out. Alt G, and I'll go up now on the Z axis. So right to about there. Copy that value, Control C, maximum Z right there, Control V. What happened to my actual bones? I think I have to use local space here. There we go. Yes, that's the case. These values are always local when you're looking in your properties window, so we have to change our local space. Otherwise, it thinks that this is 0, so it snapped my bones right down to there. So now let's see if that works. I've got local space, I've got maximum Z, and it's 0.102, so moving that up. It's not stopping it. Why is that the case? It's the Y value. We're looking in global orientation for a gizmo. So I'll switch over to the local view. And yes, the local direction for the bone is the Y axis is pointing up. So I'm going to copy this. Again, you can just put your mouse over it, Control C, and then I'll delete that, set it back to 0. Maximum Y, Control V. So now, Alt G, if I move that up, it'll stop me from going above that point right there. Alt G. I'm going to go down to right about there, and I'll copy that value on the Y-axis, Control C, and paste it. Again, I don't want to work with these two. Minimum Y, Control V, and it's negative 0.104. And again, you could make these two numbers the same because in reality, our pupils were right in the middle, at least for this one. So you could average out these values whatever you like. I don't care that the left and right aren't the same, although you might. That's totally okay. So now we have the setup working. What we might want to do, and I realized this as I was kind of working with these bones and pairing them to the head, is when you rotate the head, well, our eyes are now pointing in a weird direction. We want to make sure that the eyes are always pointing forward, even if we rotate the head. So with the head selected, I'll clear out that rotation, Alt-R. What I want to do is parent this bone to the head. So let's go ahead and press Tab to go back into edit mode of the bones. And with the target bone selected, I'll hold Shift, I'll select the head bone, and I'll press Control P and make parent, but we're going to keep offset. So now if I rotate the head in pose mode, R and then Z, the eyes will continue to look forward, hopefully. Although the head, of course, is not parented yet to any of the bones. And the eyes stayed with it, hopefully. They did not. Alright, so I'm back. I paused the video for about 5 minutes and played around with our eye and head rig. And I want to show you my solution. Now, when I left you a few seconds ago, really 5 or 10 minutes ago, when I rotated the character's head, I thought everything would be okay, but if I press R and then press Z to pose him like he's looking to one side or another, you can see that the eye bones are not sticking with the head, even though they are a child of the head. And that's because of the constraint that we put where we're controlling or constraining the eye bones to always look at the eye target bones. If I select either one of these eye bones, you can see that we have the copy location constraint on there, and we're only constraining it to be on the X and Z axes. We're using world space axes. Now there are of course other options. The option that I thought might work is local space, because that actually uses the direction of the bones, as I've stated many times. So I'm going to change both of these to local space, and I'll do that for both bones. And I thought that would do it. So now if I select and rotate the head on the z-axis, that does seem to work. And I thought I had solved it. Well, turns out if let's say I pose the head in that direction, and I want to move the eye, so I grab my eye controller bone. Well, now with local space turned on in that copy location constraint, unfortunately, it does not recognize the movement of these eye target bones because we're not actually moving these eye target bones, we're moving the parent of them, the just eye target itself, not the left or right one. If I move each individual one, yes, that does work, but this bone by itself doesn't have a constraint on it, and ideally we'd want to have control over just this bone to be able to move both eyes at once. And as you can see, that doesn't work. So I played around with the different configurations of local space versus pose space and local with parent, and in the 5 minutes I spent, I didn't find a solution. So I'm going to slightly change the way we're doing this. I'm going to select the head bone and Alt-R. Now, in order to get the eye bone to stay in sync with the eye target bone, we use the copy location constraint. Well, we're not going to use that anymore. In fact, I'm going to delete that on both eyes. Instead of parenting the eyeball itself to the head, we're going to parent the eyeballs to their respective controller bones. And because the eye target controller bone is a child of the head bone, everything will stay in sync. So right now each eyeball is parented to the head, but instead of having that, I'm going to select, in fact I'll press tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to select an eyeball bone, hold shift, select an eye target bone, of course the right corresponding one, and I'll press Control P and I'll say make parent, but keep offset. So now the eyeball bone is not connected to the head directly, it's connected as a child parent to the eye target bone, which is connected to the eye target, which is then connected to the head. I hope that makes sense. I'll say it one more time. So I'll select the other eyeball bone, hold shift, select the same eye target bone, Control P, and keep offset. So now that eye bone is a child of the eye target bone, which is then a child of the middle eye target bone, which is now then a child of the head bone. There's a bit of a string there, or a tree there, or a hierarchy there, but it does work. So now the only constraint that I have is the constraint to stop the eye controller bone from going too far to left, right, up, or down. And I have to make sure that constraint, let's see if I have that one selected in pose mode, the limit location constraint, I have it turned on to local space because that will matter when I, again, rotate this head. So with no constraints on anything except for the eye middle target bone, if I rotate the head, R and then Z, I'll put it right about there, and then I grab that bone, you can see that now I can still move it, it's still constrained, and because I've got my gizmo on local, if I move that gizmo that way it works, that way it works. But what I want to do is stop it from moving on its z-axis. Right now, of course, I'm constraining it on the x and y axes locally, but I can still move this bone on its z-axis when we're looking at the gizmo in local mode. To stop that, I'm not going to set up a constraint. I could. Instead, I'm just going to bring up my properties panel with the N key on my keyboard, or that little plus, and I'm going to lock the z local location. And as you can see, the gizmo for that disappeared. Again, it's on, now it's off. So now I can't even move it in that direction, which means it won't go too far away from the head or too far into the head. It's all set up. So I'll press A and Alt-R and Alt-G and Alt-S just to clear out any posing that we've done. And let's go ahead and connect the mesh back up to the armature. So what I'll do is I'll select the mesh. I'm going to hold shift and select any bone in the armature. Before I do that though, I want to make sure that these three eye target bones do not have any deform turned on. That's really important. We don't want the mesh to think that these three will actually control any vertices in the mesh. So I'll uncheck deform for each of those three bones in pose mode. And I think we're good to go. So I'll select a mesh, hold shift, select any bone in the armature, and I'll select Control P. Now, we've already set up all of our weight painting for this mesh, or I did between videos. So I don't want to redo the weights with automatic weights. That means that I don't want to have the vertices recalculated out to go to their nearest bone. I've already done most of that. I just have to redo a little bit for the eyeballs and the pupils. So let's go ahead and select just armature deform. And that will not change any of our weights. If I go and select the mesh, and I go into the Object Data tab, you can still see we have all these groups for the vertices that correspond with each one of the different bones. That's great, but in that list, we don't yet have one for each eye. It didn't do that. But if I rotate the head, RZ, the mesh follows along with it. But as you can see, the pupils aren't moving anywhere. Now, how do we create a group so that each one of these bones knows which vertices are attached to it? Well, again, under that Object Data tab, we have these vertex groups which correspond with bones, and they're all named the same as each bone. So I'm just going to make a new group of vertices and then attach or add the vertices that we want of each pupil to that group. We have to name the vertice group the same name as the bone. So the bone name is I.L and I.R. So with the mesh selected, under the Object Data tab, I'm going to press plus, and then it gives me a new group. I'll double click that, I.L, and I will press plus again, and I.R. Okay, so now that actually will recognize the fact that there's a bone there with that same name. Let's go back to the mesh in object mode, and let's switch over to weight paint mode. And as you can see, with that bone selected, there is nothing that's not that dark blue color. So the reason why we left these pupils sticking out of the eyes, if you were wondering why I did that, is that we can select the entire thing very easily. I'm going to select mask mode. So now I can select faces, but I'll press L on my keyboard to just select that. And with my weight paint brush, I'll make it a little bit bigger. And I'm going to paint with a strength of 1 or weight of 1. And so I can just paint. And of course, red when you're weight painting in weight paint mode, it means totally influenced by that selected bone. And because we've got masking turned on, we're not painting anything else by accident. I'm going to make sure all those vertices, even on the back, are good. I'll turn off mask mode. I'll select the other bone, turn masking back on, A, and then L to select that whole one. And I'll paint. And I believe there's probably a fill brush too. Is there? No, there's not. That's just in the other actual texture painting mode. So that looks pretty good to me. What I can do now is go back into edit mode, and I can move these pupils back in against or through the eye. What I want to do first though is actually mark seams, because again we're adding a texture, and if you want to add more than just one color to this whole pupil, you might want to mark seams. What I'll do is I'm just going to, in fact, I'm going to turn off the bones layer just so we don't get confused. I'm going to mark the seams all the way around the front of the eyeball. In case I want to draw like a pupil on there, I might mark the seams on all 4 corners. And then I'll maybe select all the edges. Control E, and we're going to mark seam. Same thing over here. And so now what I'll do is I'll select both of these pupils, L, and I'll drag them back into the head. We're in edit mode still, of course. That looks pretty good to me. I'll press tab to go back into object mode. I'll show the armature rig again, and I'm going to see if this all works. I can move the pupils around. They don't go outside that area because we've got that limit location constraint, and I can rotate the head or the head bone, R and Z, and it all looks pretty good to me. I can make him look to the side. Maybe I'll use my gizmo and point him to look up, and of course I can make him look up and look around at the same time. So that's going to be it for this video. Between now and the next video, I will give these bones custom bone shapes to make them look a little bit better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.